I scrubbed Park Seo-jun's blood off $80,000 tiles for 8 months and never said a word. Then the Hwang cartel beat me unconscious in a parking garage to find out what I knew, and I still didn't talk. That silence cost me 3 broken ribs and a shattered collarbone. It cost them everything. Seoul's deadliest crime boss doesn't forgive people who touch his property. And somewhere between the second kick to my ribs and waking up in his private hospital, I stopped being the cleaner and became the war. If you want to see how a single mother's loyalty turned into Seoul's bloodiest gang war, and why Park Seo-jun paid off my $420,000 debt before he even knew my daughter's name, you need to hear this whole story. Subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story crosses borders the same way Park's empire does. Stay until the end for the proposal scene. This is how $420,000 in medical debt, 8 minutes of torture, and one Chicago mother's stubborn mouth triggered the complete annihilation of Korea's second-largest cartel. The parking garage reeked of oil and old concrete. 1 flickering light. 2 blind spots in the security cameras. I'd memorized them months ago, the same way I'd memorized which nights Park's men carried guns under their jackets. My shift ended at midnight, but I'd stayed late to finish the 3rd floor study where someone had bled on the Persian rug. Again. My daughter Shanice's tuition payment was due in 6 days. I had $340 in my account and 47 unread texts I was too exhausted to check. I didn't hear them coming until the bag went over my head. Linda Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. At 53, she'd learned that wealthy people didn't really see their housekeepers, they saw functions. A woman who made beds. A woman who polished marble. A woman who existed in their peripheral vision and vanished the moment they needed privacy. She needed to be invisible. Because what she witnessed in Alexander Park's penthouse could destroy her faster than a fingerprint on his imported glassware. Every morning at 6, Linda rode the service elevator to the 42nd floor of the Celestial Tower, Manhattan's most exclusive residential building. The elevator operator, Miguel, never asked questions. He'd learned years ago that the best paid staff were the ones who cultivated selective blindness. Linda would nod, he would nod back, and the brass doors would close on their silent agreement. The penthouse smelled like money, that peculiar combination of leather, aged wood, and the kind of flowers that cost more per stem than Linda made in an hour. She'd slip off her shoes at the service entrance, pad across floors so pristine they reflected her worn face back at her, and begin the ritual that paid for Shanice's textbooks. Alexander Park's home wasn't just wealthy. It was calculated. Every painting positioned to impress. Every book on the shelf selected for its spine, not its content. Linda had cleaned enough penthouses to recognize the difference between old money and performing wealth. Park was performing, and his stage was immaculate. By 7:15, she'd have the kitchen gleaming. By 8:30, the living spaces would be perfect. And by 9, when Park typically emerged from his bedroom with whatever companion had stayed the night, Linda would be tucked away in the laundry room or the supply closet, waiting for the private elevator to chime their departure. That's when the real work began. She'd found the first envelope 3 months ago, tucked behind a loose panel in his home office. She hadn't been snooping, not really. The panel had simply swung open when she'd been dusting, and there it was. A manila envelope thick with documents, and a name she recognized from the news. A CEO who'd been forced to resign after allegations of fraud. Allegations that, according to these documents, Park had manufactured. Linda had closed the panel. Finished dusting. Said nothing. The second discovery came 2 weeks later. A recording device, barely larger than a button, tucked into the arrangement of a flower vase after one of Park's dinner parties. She'd been changing the water when she'd spotted it, nestled among the stems. She'd left it exactly where it was. Then the photographs. The offshore account statements. The emails printed and stored in a locked drawer she'd found keys to only because Park had left them on his dresser one morning. Each discovery was a weight added to Linda's chest. Each secret was a reason she should quit. Each document was evidence she couldn't afford to possess. But Shanice's tuition was due in 2 months. The scholarship covered most of it, but not all. Not enough. And Park paid better than anyone else Linda had ever worked for, almost suspiciously better, as if he knew that generous wages bought silence more effectively than threats. At night, after taking the subway back to her studio apartment in Queens, Linda would video call her daughter. Shanice's face would fill her phone screen, bright and alive in that way only 22-year-olds studying something they loved could be. Pre-med at Columbia. Linda's miracle. Her reason for everything. How was work, Mama? Shanice would ask, and Linda would smile and say it was fine. Just cleaning. Nothing special. The lie tasted like copper in her mouth. She couldn't tell Shanice about the envelope of financial documents she'd seen that morning, documenting what looked like a systematic scheme to bankrupt competitors. Couldn't mention the conversation she'd overheard between Park and a man whose face she recognized from congressional hearings, discussing payments that sounded distinctly like bribes. Couldn't say that every day she spent in that penthouse, she was becoming complicit in something she didn't fully understand but knew was wrong. You look tired, Shanice said, her voice softening with concern through the phone speaker. Long day, baby. But I'm fine. Tell me about your anatomy exam. And Shanice would talk, her words washing over Linda like absolution. This was why. This brilliant, kind daughter who was going to be a doctor. Who was going to help people. Who was going to have the life Linda had dreamed of but never achieved. Linda would do anything to protect that future. Even if it meant cleaning blood money. Even if it meant being invisible to a man who destroyed lives as casually as he changed his custom-tailored suits. Even if it meant pretending not to see the things that, deep down, she knew would eventually force her to make an impossible choice. The invisible woman saw everything. And that was becoming the most dangerous position of all. The parking garage at Meridian Tower smelled like motor oil and fear. Linda's heels clicked against concrete as she headed toward her sedan, arms full of case files she'd planned to review at home. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Maintenance had been promising to fix them for weeks. She didn't hear them coming. The first blow came from behind, something hard cracking against the base of her skull. Her vision exploded into white stars as the files scattered across the oil-stained floor. Strong hands grabbed her arms, yanking them behind her back with practiced efficiency. She tried to scream, but a chemical-soaked cloth clamped over her mouth, flooding her lungs with something sweet and suffocating. Don't fight it, a voice whispered in Korean-accented English. We just want to talk. The world tilted sideways as they dragged her between two vans. Her knees scraped against concrete. The cloth left her mouth, but before she could draw breath to scream, cold metal pressed against her temple. One sound, the voice said calmly, and we paint this garage with your thoughts. They zip-tied her wrists so tight she felt her fingers go numb. Someone pulled a black hood over her head, plunging her into suffocating darkness. She could hear them moving around her, 3, maybe 4 men. The sharp click of a lighter. The acrid smell of cigarette smoke mixing with the chemical haze still clouding her mind. Linda Chen. Not a question. A statement. You work for Alexander Park. She said nothing. Her legal training kicked in through the terror, name, rank, serial number. Give them nothing. We know everything about you. 28 years old. Brooklyn Law School, class of 2019. Student loan debt of $180,000. Mother in Queens, works double shifts at a nursing home. Father died when you were 12. Linda's breath came in short gasps under the hood. They'd done their homework. These weren't random muggers. We know Park trusts you, the voice continued, closer now. She could feel his breath on her neck through the fabric. Junior associate, but you handle his private matters. His sensitive arrangements. A hand grabbed her jaw, forcing her head up. Even through the hood, she could sense him leaning in. Where does Park keep his records? The real ones, not the sanitized versions he shows the IRS. I don't know what you're talking about. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The slap came fast and hard, snapping her head to the side. Her ear rang. Blood filled her mouth where her teeth cut her cheek. Wrong answer. Let's try again. Park's offshore accounts. The shell corporations in the Caymans. Where are the documents? I'm a junior associate. I file motions. I don't. This time the blow came to her stomach. She doubled over, retching, unable to breathe. Hands grabbed her hair through the hood, yanking her upright. You think Park will protect you? You think your loyalty means anything to him? The voice was almost gentle now, which somehow made it worse. He's a criminal, Linda. He uses people like you and throws them away when they're no longer useful. But you still have a chance to walk away from this. She tasted copper and chemicals. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, alone in that tiny Queen's apartment, waiting for a daughter who might never come home. Tell us where the records are, and this stops. You go back to your life. Your mother keeps her daughter. Simple choice. Linda thought about her studio apartment in Hell's Kitchen. The framed law degree she'd worked 3 jobs to earn. The mountain of debt she was barely chipping away at. Park had offered her something nobody else would. A real position, decent money, a path forward. But these men were right about one thing: he was a criminal. She'd known it the moment she saw those first files. The offshore transfers, the shell companies, the carefully worded contracts designed to obscure rather than clarify. She could give them something. A breadcrumb. A small betrayal to save herself. I can't help you, she whispered. Silence. Then, almost sadly, I was hoping you'd be smarter than this. The hood ripped off. Harsh fluorescent light stabbed her eyes. Before she could focus, rough hands grabbed her face, forcing her mouth open. She saw the pliers too late. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined. Blinding, consuming, total. She heard screaming and distantly realized it was her own voice. Blood poured down her chin as 8 minutes. They said later it was only 8 minutes from start to finish, though Linda would never believe that. 8 minutes felt like 8 hours in that concrete hell. When they finally cut the zip ties and disappeared into the shadows, she collapsed against her sedan, shaking. Blood pooled on the concrete beside the scattered case files. They'd carved their message into her silence. The Huang cartel didn't need words. Linda's eyelids felt like lead. When she finally managed to pry them open, soft morning light filtered through gauze curtains, painting everything in muted gold. The ceiling above her was pristine white, unmarred by the water stains she'd grown accustomed to in her basement apartment. For a disoriented moment, she thought she'd died. Then the pain hit. Not the screaming agony from before, but a dull, persistent ache that radiated from her abdomen through her entire body. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, gasping as the movement sent sharp protests through her midsection. Easy. A nurse materialized beside her, gentle hands guiding her back against pillows that smelled of lavender. You've had surgery. The appendicitis was quite advanced. You're lucky to be alive. Lucky. Linda almost laughed, but it hurt too much. She looked around the room slowly, taking in details that made her stomach clench with new anxiety. Private room. Equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Flowers, actual fresh flowers, on the windowsill. This wasn't the county hospital's charity ward. Where am I? Her voice came out as a croak. Manhattan Presbyterian, private wing. The nurse checked something on a monitor. You've been here 2 days. 2 days. The words hit like a physical blow. I can't afford this. There's been a mistake. I need to go to. Everything's been taken care of. The nurse's smile was professionally pleasant but final. Your bill is settled in full. Before Linda could process that impossible statement, the door opened. The nurse's expression shifted to something Linda couldn't quite read, nervousness mixed with deference, as a man entered the room. Park Seo-jun looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread. Charcoal suit tailored to perfection, crisp white shirt open at the collar, dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on billboards. He carried a bouquet of white roses so extravagant it probably cost more than Linda's monthly rent. The nurse practically fled, closing the door with a soft click that sounded unnervingly final. You're awake. His voice was deep, cultured, with the faintest trace of an accent that suggested soul boardrooms and international power plays. Good. Linda's mind raced, trying to place him. A hospital administrator? Some kind of social worker? But no, those people didn't wear watches that could pay off student loans or move with the coiled confidence of someone who'd never been told no. He set the roses on the table beside her bed with deliberate care, then turned to face her fully. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and currently burning with something that made Linda's breath catch. Do you know who I am? She shook her head, suddenly very aware of how vulnerable she was, hospital gown, weak from surgery, trapped in a bed while this stranger loomed over her. Park Seo-jun. I own the building you were trying to save your neighbor from. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The casual posture did nothing to diminish his intensity. I also own 7 other buildings in this city, 3 hotels, and a construction company that's currently redeveloping half of Lower Manhattan. Linda's mouth went dry. This was the developer. The one Mrs. Chen had been fighting. The one who'd sent those men. I didn't know who you were when I saw you collapse. His jaw tightened. I thought you were just another protester who'd gotten sick. But then I made some calls while you were in surgery. Found out exactly who Linda Martinez is and what you've been doing. I don't know what you're talking about. The words were automatic, protective. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward her. Her own face stared back from what looked like a private investigation report. Her name, her address, her debt, every pathetic detail of her financial ruin laid out in clinical detail. $420,000 in medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment. Wages being garnished. Credit destroyed. Life demolished. Your debt is paid. He said it simply, like he was commenting on the weather. All of it. Every cent. Linda's vision blurred. This had to be a dream, or maybe she was still under anesthesia, hallucinating. Why would you? Because you're under my protection now. He leaned back, and something in his expression shifted, became harder, more possessive. That scene outside my construction site, you stepping between my security and that old woman. That took guts. Stupidity too, but guts. You didn't know who I was, didn't know what kind of power you were challenging. You just saw someone who needed help and threw yourself in front of danger. I don't understand. You don't need to. Not yet. He stood, towering over her again. What you need to understand is that your old life is over. The debt collectors, the bill collectors, the constant fear, that's done. You're mine to protect now, Linda Martinez. And I take care of what's mine. The possessiveness in his tone sent ice and heat warring through her veins. I'm not yours. I don't even know you. His smile was sharp, predatory. You will. The apartment was nothing like the cramped studio Linda and Shanice had called home. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, gleaming towers that seemed to mock her with their beauty. The furniture was the kind she'd only seen in magazines, leather sofas that probably cost more than 3 months' rent, a kitchen with appliances she didn't know how to operate. Everything was pristine, untouched, like a showroom waiting for its first real occupant. Linda stood at the window, her reflection ghosting over the city lights below. Behind her, she could hear the armed guards stationed outside her door, 2 of them, always 2, rotating in 8-hour shifts. They never spoke to her beyond clipped acknowledgments. She was valuable cargo now, something to be protected and monitored in equal measure. Her phone buzzed. Shanice's face filled the screen, her daughter's smile piercing straight through the numbness that had settled over Linda like a fog. Mama. You see? I got an A on my science project. Shanice held up a poster board decorated with careful drawings of the water cycle. Mrs. Patterson said mine was the best in the whole class. Linda's throat tightened. Baby, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. She forced brightness into her voice, praying Shanice couldn't see the sterile luxury behind her, couldn't sense the guards just beyond the camera's view. Tell me everything. Did you do the presentation like we practiced? As Shanice launched into an animated description of her presentation, Linda nodded and smiled and made all the right sounds. But part of her was calculating, 3 days since Douglas Hawthorne had turned her world inside out. 3 days of blood tests and medical examinations and doctors speaking in hushed tones about her cells like they were discussing lottery numbers. 3 days of Marcus Chen's lawyers drawing up contracts that made her head spin, all while assuring her this was for her own protection. Protection. The word tasted like ash. Mama, when are you coming home? Shanice's question cut through Linda's thoughts. Aunt Teresa says you got a new job, but you've been gone longer than usual. I know, sweetie. This job it's different. But it's going to help us. Really help us. The lie came easier than it should have. What was she supposed to say? That she was trapped in a gilded cage because her blood could save billionaires? That men with guns stood between her and the door, not to keep threats out but to keep her in? Will you be home for my birthday? Shanice's voice grew smaller. It's only 2 weeks away. You promised we'd make pancakes and watch movies all day. Linda's eyes burned. I'm going to try, baby. I promise I'm going to try. After Shanice hung up, Linda remained on the couch, phone clutched in her hands. The apartment felt even larger in the silence, every luxury surface a reminder of how far she'd fallen from the life she knew. On the glass coffee table sat the contract, 40 pages of legal jargon that boiled down to a simple transaction. Her freedom for financial security. Her blood for Shanice's future. Marcus Chen had been blunt about it. You can walk away, he'd said, standing in this very apartment 3 days ago, his tone suggesting he knew she wouldn't. No one's forcing you. But consider what walking away means. Your daughter's education. Her healthcare. The roof over her head. He'd laid it out like a business proposal because that's what she was now, a business asset. Douglas Hawthorne had lived another week because of her blood. The media was already speculating about his miraculous recovery. Behind closed doors, Chen's team was working overtime to keep Linda's identity secret, to prevent every desperate billionaire and pharmaceutical company from descending on her like vultures. Linda walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Somewhere out there, Shanice was probably doing her homework at Teresa's kitchen table, maybe sneaking cookies when her aunt wasn't looking. Living the normal life Linda had fought so hard to provide. That normalcy felt like it belonged to someone else now, a person Linda used to be before she learned her blood was worth millions. Her phone buzzed again. Not Shanice this time, a message from the medical team. Another appointment tomorrow. More tests. They wanted to understand exactly what made her different, wanted to map every cell that carried this impossible gift. Gift. They kept calling it a gift, as if she should feel blessed. As if being valuable didn't also mean being vulnerable, desired, hunted. Linda stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back wore expensive pajamas provided by Chen's staff, stood in an apartment that cost more per month than she'd made in a year. But her eyes were the same, tired, determined, fierce with the kind of love that made impossible choices possible. She touched the glass where her reflection's face hovered. I'm doing this for you, baby, she whispered to the ghost of her daughter. I'm doing this all for you. The guards shifted outside her door, a reminder that some prisons came with million-dollar views. Linda stepped through the mahoral doors of Park's headquarters on Monday morning, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the worn strap of her purse. The building looked different somehow, though nothing had physically changed. The marble gleamed the same way, the security checkpoint stood in its usual position, but everything felt heavier now, weighted with meaning she couldn't quite name. The first guard who spotted her straightened immediately, his casual lean against the desk transforming into rigid attention. Ms. Chen, he said, his voice carrying a deference that made her stomach clench. Not Linda. Not the cleaning lady. Ms. Chen. She forced a smile and nodded, moving past him toward the elevators. Behind her, she heard whispered voices, quick and urgent, spreading the word of her arrival like ripples across still water. The elevator doors opened before she could press the button, the operator inside bowing slightly as she entered. She'd ridden this elevator hundreds of times, always invisible, always ignored. Now the operator wouldn't meet her eyes, staring instead at the polished floor as though afraid direct eye contact might somehow offend her. The executive floor was worse. Secretaries looked up from their desks as she passed, their conversations dying mid-sentence. A junior executive carrying files actually stepped aside, pressing himself against the wall to give her space she didn't need. Linda felt heat crawling up her neck, spreading across her cheeks. This was wrong. All of this was wrong. Park's office door stood open, and she could see him through the gap, seated behind his desk with papers spread before him. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression softened, just for a moment, before his usual mask of control slid back into place. "You're here," he said simply. "You insisted." Linda stepped inside, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. "What is this, Park? What did you tell them?" He set down the document he'd been reading, giving her his full attention. "The truth. That you're important to me. That anyone who disrespects you answers to me directly." "I was invisible," she said, and hated the way her voice cracked. "For 3 years, I could move through this building like a ghost. I could hear things, see things, because no one thought I mattered enough to notice. Now they are treating me like you matter," Park finished quietly. "Because you do." Linda wanted to argue, wanted to rage against this new reality he'd forced upon her, but the words died in her throat when she saw the files on his desk. Financial records. Shipping manifests. Names and dates and numbers that told a story of systematic destruction. The Huang cartel, piece by piece, being dismantled with surgical precision. "You're really doing it," she whispered. Park stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. "I told you. No one touches what's mine and walks away intact. The cartel thought they could use you as leverage, thought they could threaten you to control me. They were wrong." He gestured to the files, his voice taking on that cold, clinical tone she'd heard him use in negotiations. 3 of their primary distribution networks shut down in the last week. 7 key suppliers have mysteriously found their contracts terminated. Their money laundering operation through the dockyard casinos? The authorities received an anonymous tip yesterday. Very detailed. Very damaging. Linda stared at the documents, seeing not just numbers but lives, empires, power structures crumbling. "You're starting a war." "I'm ending one," Park corrected. "They started it when they put their hands on you. I'm simply finishing what they began." A knock at the door interrupted them. Park's assistant entered, the same woman who used to walk past Linda in the hallways without a glance. Now she bowed slightly, her eyes flickering nervously between Park and Linda. "Sir, the Huang representatives are here for the meeting." Park's smile was sharp and cold. "Send them in." Linda moved instinctively toward the corner, toward the shadows where she used to stand unnoticed during meetings, emptying trash bins and dusting surfaces while deals were made around her. But Park caught her wrist, gentle but firm. "No," he said softly. "Those days are over. You stand beside me now." "Park, I can't." "You can." He pulled her forward, positioning her next to his desk where she'd be visible to anyone who entered. "They need to see you. They need to understand exactly what they tried to take from me." The door opened again, and 3 men in expensive suits walked in, their confident stride faltering when they spotted Linda. She saw recognition flash across their faces, saw the calculation, the sudden fear. They knew who she was. More importantly, they knew what her presence here meant. Park didn't offer them seats. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice like silk over steel. "I believe we have some terms to discuss. Starting with your complete and immediate withdrawal from the Port District operations." Linda stood frozen, watching these powerful men shift uncomfortably, watching them glance at her with expressions mixing confusion and dread. She couldn't hide anymore. Couldn't fade into walls and disappear. Park had pulled her into the light, into his world, and there was no going back. The price of his protection, she realized, was her invisibility. And looking at the cold determination in Park's eyes as he faced down the men who'd threatened her, she wondered if that price might cost them both everything. Park's penthouse office fell silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Linda stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection ghostly against the night, while Park leaned against his desk, jacket discarded, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. The contract negotiations had stretched past midnight, but neither seemed eager to leave. "You don't flinch," Park said suddenly. "Most people do when I raise my voice. When I make threats." He studied her with that unsettling intensity she was beginning to recognize. "Why?" Linda turned from the window, meeting his gaze directly. "Because I've watched someone die slowly over 5 years, Mr. Park. Your anger is loud, yes. But death is quiet. That's what's really frightening." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that carefully maintained armor. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking, extending one toward her. When she hesitated, he said softly, "It's late. The rules can bend." She took the glass. The whiskey burned, familiar and grounding. "My husband, Michael," she began, surprised by her own voice breaking the silence. "Lung cancer. Never smoked a day in his life. Isn't that the cruelest joke?" She took another sip, the alcohol loosening words she'd kept locked away. At first, everyone rallied. Casseroles, cards, prayers. But as months turned into years, they disappeared. People can only witness suffering for so long before they need to look away. Park listened without interruption, without the performative sympathy she'd grown to hate. By the end, I was invisible. The grocery store clerks who used to chat, the neighbors who used to wave, they'd look right through me. As if grief made me contagious. As if by acknowledging me, they'd have to acknowledge that something so random and cruel could happen to them too. Her fingers tightened around the glass. I learned to be invisible. It was easier than constantly explaining, constantly reassuring others that I was okay when I wasn't. And after? Park's voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. After, I was still invisible. Widow at 43. Too young to retire, too old to start over. Too tired to try. She looked at him directly. That's why your anger doesn't frighten me. At least anger sees you. At least rage acknowledges you exist. Park set down his glass with deliberate care. He walked to the window where she stood, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed and released as if wrestling with something internal. I was 17, he said finally. My father was CEO of Park Industries then. We were at a charity gala, the kind of meaningless event the wealthy attend to pretend they care. His voice carried no emotion, which somehow made it worse. A business rival, someone my father had crushed in negotiations months before, walked up to him in the middle of the ballroom. Said hello. Smiled. And shot him 3 times in the chest. Linda's breath caught. They told me later that it was professional. That my father died instantly, felt no pain. As if that mattered. Park's reflection in the window looked haunted. What they don't tell you is how loud a gunshot is in an enclosed space. How the screaming sounds like animals. How blood spreads faster than you'd think across marble floors. He turned to face her directly, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. My mother had a breakdown. Full psychiatric hospitalization. My younger sister developed a stutter that lasted 3 years. And me? His smile was bitter. I inherited an empire at 17 and learned that mercy is how you get killed. That compassion is a luxury that gets exploited. That the only way to survive is to be more ruthless than anyone else in the room. Is that why you bought out competitors so aggressively? Linda asked. Why you destroy rather than negotiate? I don't leave anyone standing who might come back with a gun, he said flatly. Figuratively or literally. Every person I've crushed in business is someone who can't hurt my family. Can't hurt the people who depend on Park Industries for their livelihoods. Can't hurt, he stopped abruptly, jaw clenching. Linda understood what he couldn't say. Can't hurt the people he allows close. Which, she suspected, were very few. You made yourself into something terrifying, she said slowly, so nothing could terrify you again. And you made yourself invisible, he countered, so you couldn't be hurt again. The observation landed like a physical blow. Linda had never articulated it that way, but he was right. Every grey outfit, every apologetic tone, every careful non-presence, armor disguised as absence. We're both ghosts then, she whispered. You haunting your father's legacy. Me haunting my own life. Park reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand where it gripped the whiskey glass. His fingers were warm, solid, undeniably real. Then perhaps, he said quietly, ghosts can remind each other how to be human again. The city lights blurred in Linda's vision, but she didn't pull away. For the first time in longer than she could remember, invisibility felt like a choice she could unmake. And the man before her, for all his ruthless edges and calculated cruelty, suddenly seemed less like a threat and more like a mirror, reflecting the painful truth that they'd both survived by learning to stop living. But survival, Linda realized with startling clarity, wasn't the same as being alive. The city stretched below them like a carpet of diamonds, 20 million lights blinking against the velvet darkness. Isabella stood at the balcony railing, her borrowed silk robe, one of his, pooling around her bare feet. The September night air carried a hint of autumn's promise, cool enough to raise goosebumps on her arms but not cold enough to drive her inside. She'd thought he was asleep. After tonight's gala, after she'd saved him from that poisoned champagne with seconds to spare, after the paramedics had cleared him and the police had taken her statement, she'd expected him to retreat to his bedroom and process alone. That's what powerful men did, wasn't it? They compartmentalized. They recovered in private. You're thinking too loud. Isabella startled, turning to find Alexander Park emerging from the shadows of the living room. He'd changed from his tuxedo into dark slacks and a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. Even disheveled, even after nearly dying, he looked like he'd stepped from a magazine spread. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "I wasn't asleep." He crossed to the bar cart, poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal tumbler. He raised the bottle toward her in question. "No, thank you." He nodded, moved to join her at the railing. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with things neither of them had said. Below, a siren wailed. Someone's emergency. Someone's crisis. The city never truly slept. 8 months, he said finally. Isabella glanced at him. "Sir, you've been with me for 8 months." He took a slow sip of whiskey, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Did you think I didn't notice?" Her heart began a staccato rhythm against her ribs. "Notice what?" "The way you reorganize my desk drawers when you think I'm not paying attention. How you always pour my coffee exactly 3 minutes after it's brewed, because you've timed when it reaches optimal temperature. The fact that you read the Financial Times every morning before I wake up, so you can anticipate which articles might affect my meetings." He turned to her then, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "The way you watch me when you think I'm focused on something else." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Mr. Park." "Alexander," he said quietly. "After tonight, I think we can drop the formalities." She couldn't look away from him. Didn't want to. "I don't know what you're asking me." "I'm not asking anything." He set the whiskey tumbler on the railing with a soft clink. "I'm telling you that I've been aware of you every single day since you walked into this penthouse. That I know you take your tea with honey instead of sugar, that you're afraid of thunder but you'd never admit it, that you bite your lower lip when you're concentrating on something difficult." "You shouldn't notice those things," she whispered. "I know." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "I shouldn't have hired you in the first place. I shouldn't have let you stay after that first week when I realized you were different from everyone else in my world. I definitely shouldn't be standing this close to you right now." But he was. Somehow, without her noticing, the space between them had collapsed to inches. Different how? The question escaped before she could stop it. "You're honest," he said simply. "Brutally, inconveniently honest. You're the only person in my life who tells me the truth, even when it costs you something. Especially when it costs you something. Do you know how rare that is? How?" He paused, his jaw working. "How intoxicating." Isabella's fingers tightened on the railing. "I saved your life tonight." "You did. Someone wanted you dead." "They did. And you're standing here talking about how I organize your desk drawers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "What would you prefer I talk about?" Everything she'd kept locked away for 8 months surged toward the surface. Every careful boundary she'd maintained, every professional distance she'd enforced, every time she'd watched him from across the room and forced herself to feel nothing, all of it crumbled like sand. "I should quit," she said. "Probably. This is wildly inappropriate." "Absolutely. There are 50 reasons why this can't happen." "At least 50, he agreed. His hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away, to retreat, to restore the walls between them. His fingers brushed her jaw with devastating gentleness. "Tell me to stop, Isabella." She couldn't. God help her, she couldn't form the words. When his lips met hers, the city disappeared. The danger, the rules, the impossible gulf between their worlds, none of it mattered. His kiss was nothing like she'd imagined during those long, sleepless nights. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was certainty. It was truth. It was 8 months of carefully maintained pretense shattering into glittering pieces that scattered across the balcony floor and dissolved into starlight. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard. "This changes everything," she whispered. "I know," Alexander said. His thumb traced her lower lip, the touch achingly tender. "I know." The black sedan exploded at 3:47 a.m., 3 blocks from Park's downtown headquarters. The force shattered windows across 2 city blocks and set off car alarms for half a mile. Emergency services arrived within minutes to find twisted metal and burning debris scattered across the intersection. The bomb had been sophisticated, military-grade, designed to obliterate anything within a 20-foot radius. Park stood in his office 30 floors above the chaos, watching the emergency lights pulse against the pre-dawn darkness. The call had come 2 minutes before the detonation, a warning from one of his network contacts deep inside the Huang organization. His driver had been rerouted. The car that exploded had been empty, positioned as bait in a trap that had just snapped shut on the wrong prey. "The Huang cartel," Minute Jun said quietly, ending a call. "Confirmed." They moved up their timeline after the hospital incident. Park said nothing. He watched the fire crews work below, their movements efficient and practiced. The Huangs had made their move. They had chosen escalation. They had chosen war. What they didn't understand was that Park had been preparing for this moment since the day he decided to dismantle their empire. Every contingency had been mapped. Every response had been calculated. They had just triggered their own annihilation. "Begin," Park said. The first strike came at market open. Every Huang-owned business found their credit lines frozen simultaneously. Banks that had extended loans for decades suddenly discovered irregularities in their accounts. Trading partners received anonymous tips about import violations. Supply chains that had operated smoothly for years ground to a halt as shipping containers were flagged for inspection at every port. Park had spent months mapping their financial infrastructure, identifying every pressure point, every vulnerability, every thread that held their empire together. Now he pulled them all at once. The second strike was surgical. Documents appeared on the desks of prosecutors in 3 countries, meticulously organized evidence of tax evasion, money laundering, customs fraud, and bribery. Each file was complete, cross-referenced, indexed for easy prosecution. The paper trail was irrefutable. Park had built it carefully, gathering proof while the Huangs had assumed themselves untouchable. By noon, the first raids were underway. Police descended on Huang businesses across the city. News cameras captured executives being led out in handcuffs. The coverage was immediate and brutal. The empire that had operated in shadows for 3 generations was suddenly exposed to merciless daylight. The third strike targeted their political protection. Every official who had accepted Huang bribes received a personal visit from Park's representatives. The message was simple: distance yourself now, or the evidence goes public. Photographs, recordings, financial transfers, Park had documented everything. Politicians who had built careers on Huang money suddenly discovered their loyalty had limits. Support evaporated overnight. Park watched it unfold from his office, tracking each development with the detachment of a chess grandmaster executing a forced checkmate. The Huangs scrambled, trying to contain the damage, but there was no defense against an attack on every front simultaneously. Their lawyers couldn't keep pace with the charges. Their accountants couldn't explain the frozen assets. Their enforcers couldn't intimidate prosecutors who had ironclad cases. The fourth strike was personal. Park's investigators had spent weeks tracking the Huang family's personal assets, properties held in shell companies, offshore accounts, investments hidden behind layers of corporate structures. Now every asset was seized, every account frozen, every property flagged for investigation. The family that had lived in luxury for generations watched their wealth disappear in real time. Old Man Huang called on the third day. His voice shook with rage and something else, fear. He threatened, he blustered, he tried to negotiate. Park listened in silence until the old man ran out of words. "You tried to kill me," Park said quietly. "You failed. Now you learn what failure costs." He ended the call. The final strike came a week later. Every remaining Huang business asset was acquired by shell companies Park controlled. The purchases were legal, executed at fair market value through intermediaries. But the message was clear: the Huang Empire no longer existed. Everything they had built now belonged to Park. The family fled. Old Man Huang and his sons left the country under cover of darkness, taking whatever liquid assets they had managed to hide. They scattered to different continents, refugees from their own ambition. The organization that had terrorized the underworld for decades disappeared like smoke. Park stood at his window the night after their departure, watching the city lights stretch to the horizon. Seoul moved on as if the Huangs had never existed. Business continued. Life continued. The vacuum left by their absence was already being filled. Minute Jun entered quietly. "It's confirmed. The entire leadership is gone. What remains of their organization has sworn loyalty to you." Park nodded slowly. The Huangs had forced his hand with their bombing attempt. They had chosen total war. And they had learned, too late, that Park didn't fight wars he couldn't win absolutely. The message was sent. The demonstration was complete. Anyone who challenged Park's authority would face not defeat, but total annihilation, surgical, comprehensive, and irreversible. Linda stood on the penthouse terrace, the Seoul skyline glittering before her like a constellation of possibilities. The same marble she'd once scrubbed on her knees now gleamed beneath designer heels that still felt foreign on her feet. 6 months had passed since that horrific night in the warehouse, 6 months since Park had destroyed Marcus Chen's empire with the precision of a surgeon removing a cancer. Park moved behind her, his presence as solid as the mountains surrounding the city. She felt his warmth before his arms encircled her waist, pulling her back against his chest. The gesture was protective, possessive, and entirely unlike the man who'd once barked orders while she cleaned around him in silence. "Do you remember the first time you stood here?" His voice rumbled against her spine, carrying an intimacy that made her heart stutter. Linda's laugh came soft and tinged with disbelief. "I was terrified I'd break something. Everything in this penthouse cost more than my entire year's salary. You were invisible to me then." Park's confession held no shame, only stark honesty. "Another servant moving through my space, unworthy of notice. I was a fool." She turned in his arms, studying the face that had once seemed carved from ice. Time and trauma had softened something in Park Jinwoo, revealed the man beneath the ruthless CEO facade. The kidnapping had cracked them both open, and somehow they'd rebuilt themselves together, mixing broken pieces until the seams became part of their shared foundation. "We were both different people," Linda said, touching his jaw with fingers that no longer trembled in his presence. "I was hiding from the world, and you were hiding from yourself." Park captured her hand, pressing it against his heart. The gesture was uncharacteristically tender for a man whose business rivals still whispered his name with fear. "I'm not good at pretty words, Linda. My father taught me to command, to conquer, to never show weakness." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "But you make me want to try." He released her hand and reached into his jacket pocket. Linda's breath caught as he withdrew a small velvet box, its presence on the terrace suddenly making the glittering skyline feel like an audience to a moment she'd never dared to imagine. "This terrace is where I first truly saw you," Park said, opening the box to reveal a ring that caught the city lights like captured starfire. "You were standing exactly where you are now, and the sunset hit your face in a way that made me actually stop and look. Really look. I realized I'd never actually seen you before that moment, despite months of you moving through my home." Linda's eyes burned with tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry. The ring was stunning, an emerald surrounded by diamonds that probably cost more than her childhood home, but it was the meaning behind it that made her chest tighten with emotion. Park dropped to one knee, a position of vulnerability that Linda knew cost this proud man everything. "I can't promise to be easy to love. My empire has enemies, my methods have consequences, and my past is written in blood." His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "But I can promise that you will never be invisible again. Not to me, not to anyone. You will stand beside me as my equal, my partner, the woman who makes me want to be more than just the monster my father created. Park, Linda's voice broke on his name. Marry me, Linda. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that even broken people can build something beautiful from the ashes. Linda pulled him to his feet, her hands framing his face as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Yes, to all of it. The empire, the enemies, the complicated beautiful mess of us. Park slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, then kissed her with a passion that made the city lights blur into abstraction. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Linda rested her forehead against his. Shanice is moving to Seoul next month, she said, joy threading through her words. She got accepted to the international school. She's so excited she can barely sleep. Park's smile was genuine, transforming his face into something younger, lighter. Good. She should be here. This is your home now, Linda. Both of you. He hesitated, then added with unusual uncertainty, I want to do this right. Be the man you both deserve. Linda thought about the invisible cleaner she'd been, the woman who'd scrubbed floors and swallowed humiliation because survival demanded it. She thought about Marcus's cruelty, the warehouse torture, the moment she'd accepted death. And then she thought about this, standing on a terrace in Seoul, wearing a ring that symbolized her transformation from invisible to irreplaceable, preparing to marry a man who'd learned to see her only after they'd both been broken and rebuilt. You already are, she said simply, and meant it. If this story touched your heart, like and subscribe for more tales of unexpected love and powerful transformations. See you in the next video.